You may be aware, ladies and gentlemen, or rather you will almost certainly be aware of the Socialist Workers' Party, which has for the past 4 decades or thereabouts specialised in seeking out and attaching itself to and hijacking various working class grievances. Therefore, if the workers at a button factory in Leeds feel aggrieved about their company's policy on tea breaks and go on strike, sooner or later you will see the well-known type font of the Socialist Workers, and you'll see these rather aging men nowadays in their donkey jackets on the picket lines, co-opting these workers and teaching them about the good news of Leon Trotsky. Now, the Libertarian Alliance has always had a certain interest in the tactics of the Socialist Workers' Party. Indeed, we have, during the past 3 decades, done our very best to imitate those tactics, obviously adapting them to local circumstances. Therefore, we have an outreach to organisations like the Traditional Britain Group, and I was very pleased to speak at last year's conference and very honoured to be invited back to speak at this year's conference. But we do not specialise in coming and talking to people such as yourselves. We also are members of Backlash. We are associated with a group of people who believe in the enjoyment of what many of you in this room would regard as thoroughly degenerate lifestyles. I have spoken to a number of Islamic groups about libertarian ideas. We will speak to anyone, and the idea is that we will try to bring as many people over as possible to an appreciation of and a sympathy towards and indeed an embrace of libertarian ideas. I think the difference between us and the Socialist Workers, apart from the ideological differences of course, the differences are, first, it may be regrettable or it may not be regrettable, but I do not have the equivalent of the Unite Against Fascism movement. I am not able to send my people onto the streets to beat up my various opponents. The other difference is that I do try to be honest in my objectives. I do try to be honest in what I'm trying to do. I will not come here and jolly you along and try to sell libertarianism to you as if I were trying to get you onto hard drugs by offering you a bit of cannabis and then a bit of coke and then move up to the hard stuff. No. So let me say what I believe, or let me say what I want. I believe in what Paul Gottfried calls bourgeois civilization, or to give my own interpretation of that. I want to live in a world where everyone enjoys equal rights to life, liberty and property. I want this in England. I want this in France and Germany and Russia. I want it in Japan. Of course I want it in America, if possible. I want it in Black Africa. I want it in the Middle East. I want it in Iran. I want it in China. I want to spread libertarian ideas throughout the world, regardless of ethnicity or religion or any of the other things that divide one human group from another. I believe in economic progress. I believe in economic and technological and scientific progress. I like the way that the graph of technological progress has been doing this for the past 200 years. All I regret is that I'm alive at a time before the upward trend turns perfectly vertical. And I regard the natural world which I'm sure many of you regard with romantic veneration, as a vast storehouse of resources which we human beings can exploit so that we can understand and take charge of the forces of nature and to use those to produce our own greater convenience and greater comfort. That is what I believe, which may often, in one or two senses, be at variance with what some of you appear to believe, if I have correctly heard some of today's speeches and comments. Now, having said that, I'm not entirely a cuckoo in the nest. I'm not entirely an ideological alien who has come among you and is now pulling the mask off his face to show the grinning skull beneath. I do have a strong appreciation of conservative values. Indeed, in some respects, I am a conservative. I do greatly admire Edmund Burke and Lord Salisbury. And of course, in our own time, I very greatly admire Enoch Powell. Yeah. Very great men. Very great men who told many truths which I regret to say many of my fellow libertarians do not fully appreciate. That we should embrace our conservative sides rather more than many of us have done. There are a number of reasons for this. The first is purely a matter of tactics. It is extremely difficult to defend liberal or libertarian institutions in purely abstract terms. I could give you a number of very good reasons in favour of things like freedom of the press, trial by jury, freedom of contract, freedom of association, and all the other liberal values. I could give you some very good abstract justifications of those ways of thought and institutions. But by far the most powerful defence of those things, when they do exist, is the fact that they are established and they have existed for a very long time. The best argument in England at the moment for the defence of trial by jury is not to talk about the way in which a random process prevents political prosecutions or engages ordinary people with the criminal justice system. The best defence is simply to say it was ever thus in England. You go back to the 13th century and there was trial by jury. It has always been. It is part of our deep folkways. And anyone who tries to abolish trial by jury, indeed anyone who tries to compromise the fundamental principle of trial by jury, is not un-libertarian, but un-British, un-English. He is an enemy of our civilization. And you can make the same defence of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of contract, freedom of trade, you name it. These libertarian or liberal values are often best defended by wrapping them in a coating of traditional conservatism. Now that is I suppose, a conditional argument for why libertarians should embrace certain aspects of conservatism. I think the other reason is that although there are many libertarians who apply the doctrine or doctrines in a rather wooden way, these are often referred to among you as the suicide cult libertarians, we have to accept that we are where we are. Although, as I have said, I want the Islamic world, I want China, I want India, I want Russia. I want the whole of the human race to embrace the good news of libertarianism. I do accept that at present, and for the foreseeable future, libertarian ideas are more likely to take hold or more likely to remain entrenched within some peoples than others. There are some people who appear to be more fitted at the moment for libertarianism than for others, and to drop the dancing about the bush, to drop the beating about the bush, I do regard any libertarian who talks about absolute open borders as a requirement of libertarian ideas as a fool. There are many other allowances which must be made for local conditions. I have come across libertarians who talk glibly about privatising the monarchy, whatever that means. I've come across people who talk about how we must abolish trial by jury because it's based on a kind of conscription. Well, yes, it is, but so what? Trial by jury is one of the great defences of liberty, and if it requires a bit of conscription, let us have that conscription. You must adapt any ideology, if it is to have any purchase on reality, to the conditions in which you find yourselves. And so, I am not a wooden ideologue who has come here simply to preach at you. I do accept many of your arguments, and even when I disagree with you, I try to do so with reasons rather than moralistic preaching. Though one thing I will say, I have read a lot of Nietzsche and Julius Evola, which may or may not be the correct pronunciation of his name. I've read some Francis Papaiotti. I am familiar with websites like the Occidental Observer, Alt-Right, Countercurrent, many, many very naughty publications that a well-brought-up libertarian like me should not even admit to knowing exist. But although I think there are matters there of incidental interest. There are some points very well made, and sometimes the negative critiques have a certain value. I must say that when we proceed from critique to some kind of prescription, some kind of recommendations, I do find that writers like Nietzsche, Evola, Yockey, Carl Schmitt, with whom I'm vaguely familiar, I do find that the entire collected mass of their writings contains far less of value to the human condition than a railway bridge built by Brunel. It really says nothing to me, and it leaves me cold. No, I would like you all to be much more libertarian than you so far appear to have been. No, why should I be asking you to become libertarians, or to embrace your libertarian side, or to reconnect with your libertarianism? Well, two reasons really. There is the intrinsic reason and the conditional reason, if I could use those philosophical terms which will explain themselves as I go along. At the moment throughout the world there is a reversion to folkways, a reversion to traditional ways of thought and conduct. You can see this most clearly in the Islamic world. I am told that if you'd been in Cairo 50 years ago in the early 1960s, you would have seen, it would have looked like a fairly standard Mediterranean city. Young women wearing standard Western fashions, young men in suits, people driving cars, people going to cocktail bars and nightclubs and theatres and what have you. And you'd have seen the same in Istanbul, and you would, throughout the Islamic world, Tehran is a good case, have seen the middle classes eagerly and without any great self-consciousness embracing Western norms. That's all gone. That's all gone. Increasingly throughout the Islamic world, you'd have trouble getting a drink. Increasingly throughout the Islamic world, if a woman goes out dressed other than in some black pillar box, she'll get acid thrown in her face. The Iranians have a rather interesting sartorial style. They wear well-cut suits and nice shirts, but no ties. They have their own way of dressing. You'll see this in China, which is metamorphosed, it is changing. Pardon me. It is changing before our eyes from some kind of degenerate Western heresy, i.e. Marxism, into some kind of restored Mandarin Republic. Or you'll see this in Russia, which is also moving itself away from this degraded Western heresy of Marxism towards the idea of a strong authoritarian state supporting and supported by a strong and authoritarian Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
And you'll see it throughout the world. There is a reversion to ancestral ways. Now, if I ask what are our ancestral ways, the answer is nothing in anything that I've read by people like Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher. Nothing that I have seen in Julius Evola. Certainly nothing I've seen in Nietzsche. What are our folkways? What are our ancestral ways? Why? Our ancestral ways are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of contract, freedom of trade, the idea that the state is not the same as society, the idea that the authorities should be limited in some way. Those are our folkways. You cannot regard men like Bacon, Locke, Newton, Hume, Darwin, or Bentham, Adam Smith, and all of the others. You cannot regard these as thoroughly wicked men who perverted the English or the British mind out of its natural way of thought. These are men who simply express the English or British way of thinking. Those men, directly or indirectly, have had enormous influence over the English-speaking mind. But the reason they have had such influence is because at the same time they are only putting into very clear and concise words what most of us were already thinking. And so that is a very strong reason for those of us who are English-speaking conservatives also to pay a great deal of attention to the libertarian or classical liberal philosophers, because that is our way. But let me move to the conditional reason for why conservatives should give a great deal more respect to liberalism or to libertarianism. I use the two words liberalism and libertarianism interchangeably. They mean much the same, though I do take Gregory's accusation of cancer. Let us suppose, let's make a big supposition. Let's suppose that the present order of things were to come to an end tomorrow. Let us suppose that a meltdown in the bond market, or an army of students storming Westminster, or something. Let's suppose that our people were to form a government. Now, how on earth do you think that you or your friends will form a government in this country? Do you know how to run the BBC? Do you know how to run the National Health Service? Do you know how to run English Heritage? Do you know how to run any of the institutions through which the left exercises its hegemony? And the answer is no. And that is no criticism of you. The thing is that those people who fully understand how English heritage works are the people who believe in it, because nobody else is going to take the trouble to find out how it works. And so there are very few of us. We would be sitting on top of a building, we'd be sitting in the penthouse suite of a building, and all the way from the 15th down to the 10th floors, you have this vast mass of people who hate us, and who at the first opportunity will break into the penthouse suite and toss us over the edge. It doesn't help that the bottom 10 stories are people who are cheering us on, because those people are not in the short term very important. How, if Conservatives were to form a government, would you take control of the British state? And the answer is not by appointing one of your friends Director General of the BBC and another of your friends Head of Information at English Heritage. I'm talking about English Heritage because I recently had to renew my membership, and I'm still rather annoyed at the cost. But no, I would suggest that even if you do not really believe in the idea of a small state and of completely unassisted self-help within society at large, even if you believe in a large and powerful and active state, this is not something that you will be able to get in the near future, because all the personnel you need to run that large and powerful and activist state will be working against you. That's the case now. That will be the case for the foreseeable future. And so even if you do not like libertarians or libertarian ideas, I think it is a very good idea to acquaint yourself with the ways in which institutions can be left to coordinate themselves without state control. You need to learn to do without many of the instruments that you do not regard as in themselves illegitimate, but which you do resent to see in the hands of the left. You cannot take the instruments away from them, because the left is the institutions, and the institutions are the left. If you want to destroy the left, you must also look at destroying many of these institutions, which will necessarily leave you with something like a liberal state. Now, how long have I been speaking?
Too long.
Well, sorry,
Sean, carry on.
in temporal terms, not moral.
Carry on, you've got
Okay.
time.
You're fine, sure.
Yes.
Carry on.
And so I forget the title of the talk that I agreed. It's something about
Preserving ancestral.
Yes, Britain and the global reversion to ancestral ways.
Yes. It sounds rather authoritarian, doesn't it? Britain and the reversion to ancestral ways. But I do suggest that it isn't, and it certainly shouldn't be. There is a natural alliance between libertarians and conservatives. I freely admit that libertarians, on the whole, can learn a lot from conservatives. You know what many of us are like. You've read some of our stuff. You must have looked up some of our blogs where people are talking utter moonshine. Things which cannot and should not be allowed to be. But at the same time, I do suggest that you have much to learn from us, if you have not done so already. You have these two things to learn. The first is to learn what is the nature of our folkways. Not the nature of the folkways given to us by German and Russian and Italian conservative philosophers, no matter how unjust I may have been to them earlier. The second is that if you want to come to power and stay in power, you will necessarily, in many of your policies, need to behave interchangeably with libertarians. And so with those words, I would like to thank you for the great indulgence you have shown in not only listening in silence, but in not taking me outside and lynching me.